Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
When is the general election?
Well, I think November the 21st is actually the most likely.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, recorded at my favourite pub table here in Westminster, stone's throw from the gates of Parliament. Weekly, I bring you the best guests, gossip and stories from this pub table in the heart of Westminster. This week we're looking at what's going on in a packed political year with general elections in the UK and America. Later, I'll be talking to Gerry Gunster about November's presidential election in America. But first, it's a busy time electorally here in the UK with local elections next month in May and the highly anticipated general election expected by most people in the autumn. And with me now to look at his political polling crystal ball is pollster Joe Twyman. Joe, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to have you here.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Who's going to win the general election?
Well, as you know, Chris, polling is only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the time, and things can certainly change. But certainly based on the polling that we've seen, not just now, but really for the last few years, is looking very like a Labour victory.
By some margin. There's been an MRP poll, a seat-by-seat poll out this week, giving a 203-seat gain to the Labour Party of 400 MPs after the election.
Yeah, and that result would have been an enormous shock to anyone, unless, of course, they'd happened to look at any of the polling over the last couple of years. If you go back to December 2021, that was the last time that the Conservatives were ahead in any published poll. And September 2022 is the last time that Labour were under double digits ahead. And so the long-term trends consistently look bad for the Conservatives. Yep. But two things to remember. Firstly, the challenge that's still ahead of Labour in historic terms is enormous. They need a swing in excess of what Tony Blair got in 1997 just to get a majority of 2. They need over 120 gains. By historical standards, that's an enormous number. But also, the polls may contract. Historically, they have, and so we would expect a similar thing now. This will be my 9th general election working as a pollster or an analyst in some respect, and so those various years of plugging in numbers have taught me that nothing can be taken for granted.
You're not always right. In 2015, 2017, the polls were wrong, although YouGov, where you were, MRP was right in 17, but polls can be wrong.
Yes, that's right. I mean, a lot of attention was paid to the poll that I was involved in 2017 that did say 10 days out from the election that we might be looking at a hung parliament, and that's attracted an awful lot of attention. But there were other MRP polls in 2017 that were showing the same as other polling that the Conservatives were on for a victory. So MRP in and of itself is not some sort of magic bullet, but it is very expensive and so tends to attract a lot of attention.
I made note of some dates there when you were speaking. September 2021, of course, was a time when everyone was forecasting a 3-term Johnson government. That didn't come to pass. And September 2022 was probably just before Liz Truss took over. So to what extent do you think is this collapse in support being self-inflicted?
Well, it's certainly been the case that this is an issue the Conservatives faced before Boris Johnson left. While he was in Downing Street, the underlying data was declining, as voting intention was as well. But certainly Liz Truss's short period in Downing Street only helped to damage the reputation and the position of the Conservatives even further.
And removing Johnson, maybe? Or you think by the end Johnson was a dead duck, but certainly back in September 2021, before all the dramas about Owen Paterson and then Partygate,
I think
salvageable.
I think that if Boris Johnson was still there, the situation overall would not be significantly different.
Are we in 1992 or 1997, do you think?
Well, in 19...
By that I mean, obviously we're at the same time in power as 92, 13 years, 14 years of Tory government.
Yeah.
Behind in the polls, they pull it round in the election campaign and scrape a win. Or is it a Labour landslide majority in 97? The
key difference for me is the underlying data around which party is strongest on the economy. The cost of living is the most important issue by some distance for the majority of voters. And back in 1992, it was the case that the Conservatives were still seen as the best party on the economy going into the election. Now, they damaged that with September 16th, 1992 and Black Wednesday, but it was enough to get them over the line in the April election. 1997, they still hadn't recovered from Black Wednesday, and indeed it took them many years after that to recover. The situation the Conservatives are in now is dire when it comes to the economy. For the last 9 months, we've been polling on which party would be best, simply offering the choice to Conservative and Labour. Conservative have only been higher than 33% once, and they've never been lower than 28% during that entire 9-month period. In other words, statistically unchanged. Labour consistently have a lead of double digits over the Conservatives on the economy, and they're also doing very well on leadership. That points to a 97 type situation, not 92.
And are you counting don't know? So number 10, a short walk from here, always say that they think 25%, 28% of people that haven't decided yet who voted Tory last time, they're the ones to target. If they can bring them back on side, they're near a parity with Labour.
Well, you would expect number 10 to say that. They're not going to hold their hands up and say, I tell you what, guys, we're really
Well, actually,
doomed.
George Osborne said recently on his podcast, he thought that it was massively exaggerated at the Labour lead because of lack of don't know counting.
We do look at don't knows, but the idea that those people who say don't know are en masse going to go back to who they voted for is not borne out by historical precedent. Of course, that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but I think it's very unlikely. I think a proportion of those people will go back. It's worth looking at in the run-up to 97 how things did contract. Back then, people were talking about a Canada-style wipeout, where the governing party in Canada in 1993 went from over 200 seats down to just 2. And people, because they share an electoral system with us, people in the run-up to 97 were saying, are we looking at a similar wipeout then? Because back then, Labour were on 57% of the vote in some polls. But the polls did contract, and in the end, the Conservatives won over 160 seats, more than 90 of which had not changed hands since the Second World War. I imagine we'll see similar contraction this time, but we may not. We'll have to wait and see.
If the Tories are so unpopular, why is Labour doing all it can to copy its policies?
Because
I don't understand that.
I wouldn't say it's copying all its
Most of
policies.
us, there's very little difference with the two main parties.
What you don't want to do, I imagine, from a Labour point of view, is firstly fire out any big differences at the moment. What's the point in firing your big guns at this stage? If, to use a football metaphor, if your opposition is not only scoring lots of goals in their own goal, but also kicking each other in the head repeatedly, you don't go full-on attack. You wait. You bide your time, and then when they're completely ruined, you start scoring. And I imagine we'll see the same sort of thing. I imagine we'll see the Labour announcing policies that are, in some cases, radically different from the Conservatives. But they don't want to announce them now and have them either attacked or stolen.
So this Ming vase idea, the Labour lead is like a Ming vase being held by a kid's arm walking across a greasy floor. He daren't drop it. Is that where we are? Essentially, don't risk anything.
I would say that that is an overstatement of how delicate Labour's lead is. But if you're in Labour's position, you would be cautious because you'd be right to be. But also, as I say, there's no need to fire out your big guns at the moment. You just have to sit back and let the opposition score its own goals, and you maintain your lead in the polls, which, as I say, has been in place now for years.
We haven't mentioned Reform UK yet. We don't know what Nigel Farage might do, if he might take over and start running Reform UK with Lee Anderson and Richard Tice. Is that a concern for the Tory party? It might get worse.
I'm sure it will be a concern for the Conservatives. I think Reform have certainly been the success story of the polls in the last few months, but whether they can sustain that, particularly going into a general election campaign, remains to be seen. I don't know what approach they're taking to the local elections, for instance, but that might scupper some of their momentum.
Are they a protest party, or are they actually a party?
Well, I mean, they're technically a company.
They're a company, yeah.
So we could discuss that until we're blue in the face. But certainly they seem to have done a relatively good job of mopping up the kind of people who are dissatisfied, disapproving and distrusting, not just of individual political parties and politicians, but actually of the political process in general. A lot of those people previously went to UKIP or the Brexit Party. The difference with Reform is they tend to overwhelmingly now be Conservative voters, whereas previously they were drawn from a much more wider political base.
And is it right that reform should pull the Tories to the right, where fewer voters are, because the Tories should be in the centre ground, like Labour's trying to be, where you win most votes?
It's never really been hugely successful. The Conservatives couldn't out-UKIP, though they tried, and looking to embrace some of the Brexit Party to an extent was successful in individual constituencies. But I don't think it would be as successful this time. There is a real danger that you alienate the moderate Conservatives by moving too far to the right. So it's a difficult tightrope and represents the difficulty that Conservatives are in on both flanks, from their left and from their right. From those two parties.
More likely is the Lib Dems gaining MPs at the election. I mean,
yeah, I think Lib Dem gains looks likely. The local elections in May will be really important for them. Traditionally, they were the party of local government, but various underperformance in elections over the last 20 years have reduced those numbers. It will be interesting to see if they can come back.
And their lesson is probably not to form another coalition.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see them going into formal coalition anytime soon. But as I say,
if it's hung Parliament,
yeah, it's worth repeating that the swing that Labour need by historical standards
is
enormously large, just to get a majority of two. And let's face it, a majority of two is no use at all. And so maybe the Lib Dems might have a role, but I very much doubt it will be formal. I think it would be confidence of supply.
Yeah, and just looking into the May local elections, which councils are you looking at?
Well, there's a lot, inevitably with local council elections, there's always a combination of different things. But I think that Dudley is very interesting, Dorset, Basildon, and then Nuneaton, which...
Dudley goes red, Dorset goes yellow.
Yes, potentially. Those are the places that the Conservatives currently hold. But I think the major contests actually will be the two mayoral elections in Tees Valley and the West Midlands. I think if the Conservatives can hold on to those mayoralties, so Ben Houghton and Andy Street, if they can hold on and they can overperform against expectations in London with Susan Hall, they don't even need to win in London, but if they can overperform there, I think that will be a story that they'll be able to sell as a positive. But I think even that will be a struggle. That last time around they won 966 councillors. They could lose up to 500 of those, because last time these elections were held, their vote share was basically double what it is at the moment. So they could lose 500 of those. If they can keep those losses to 300 to 400, again, maybe that's a positive, but it's certainly looking like quite a challenge. And a gain of 300 for Labour could be and picking up all the mayoralties could be a really good story.
And a morale-sapping blow for the Tory party, because these are people on the ground who have jobs with these councils. They get expenses to work for these councils, don't they? And there's almost it's a network of support they need.
Yeah, it's another
Yeah.
morale sapping situation, and so if it is worse than expectations, or actually even if it's as bad as expectations, the momentum that hands to Labour, and of course, as we know, momentum is so important in elections. The momentum that hands to Labour with potentially 3 or 4 months until a general election, that's enormous.
And Joe, I've got to ask you the big question, the big parlour game in Westminster is, when is the general election? It's always 1 month away from the date we're talking, but what do you think it is?
Well, I think November the 21st is actually the most likely.
What's your workings on that?
Well, that's my interpretation of the rules around electoral funding and the conventions and rules around electoral timing. If, and it is a big if, you call the election at the end of the Conservative Party conference, my understanding is that the soonest you can then have the election would be 21st November. That assumes the party conferences go ahead, and they go ahead when they're scheduled. But assuming that's the case, it's 21st November.
And we assume they're going ahead because cancelling them is so expensive, and they do make money off these events.
Yes, it's reported the Conservatives make £7 million profit. Whether they'll make that this year remains to be seen, but certainly they make money. And if they call it before then, that money has to be counted within the election expenses, which would be hugely problematic.
And by then, I suppose you can price in the effects of November the 5th, the US elections.
Yes, November the 5th, US elections, which could potentially be problematic for Labour to have to deal with.
If Trump wins.
Well, even if Trump doesn't win, even if it's an unknown result by that stage, or if Trump loses but refuses to concede and all these sorts of things, that's the kind of thing that can create issues for Labour. So you price that in. Plus, each day that goes past the summer, that you would assume the small boat situation would improve. So there are indications.
And the economy.
Potentially. So there are indications for why 21st of November, I think, is all right. So you heard it here first, folks.
And just finally, what the odds do you think on a Tory win this year at the general election? I've heard 1% from a rival of yours.
I would never describe Professor John Curtis as a rival, simply as a colleague and friend. And I would...
Is he overacting it there?
I would say if my last 8 general elections have taught me anything, is that you can't rule anything out. But I certainly think single-digit percentage chance is a reasonable expectation.
Well, Joe...
But anything can happen.
With that massive caveat, Joe Twyman, thank you for joining us today for Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we're off to America to speak to our US expert, Gerry Gunster. Not me, alas. I'll be in the Westminster studio, but he'll be down the line. With me now is Gerry Gunster from Gunster Worldwide Strategies. Gerry would have been in the UK this week for our podcast, but he's been laid low with a health issue in America. So he's joining us from his office in Washington, D.C. Gerry, well, good afternoon from the UK. Good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning, Chris. How are you? Yes, a little bit laid up, but happy to be here. Wish I was sitting in the pub with you right now, but this will suffice.
Yeah, I had your best tipple lined up for you, Gerry. Now, I've known you for a best part of, nearly a decade now, working with on covering referendums, and you've been a referendum advisor, and you're a political animal. You're someone who knows Washington very well. You know Donald Trump very well, maybe less so Joe Biden. I've got an easy question first off for you in the November the 5th election in the States. Who's going to win?
So, look, we're 214 days away now from the election, and every single poll is indicating right now that Donald Trump has a slight lead in almost all the national polling. Now, Chris, you and I know based on 2016 that when you start doing these kinds of predictions that you ought to throw the crystal ball out because it's almost impossible sometimes to predict. But yeah, we're 214 days away, and all the indications are that Donald Trump is in the lead. Now, you have to remember one thing about American politics, and that is that we have an electoral college system. So with that system, we have battleground states. And so as you look at all the national polling, really what you need to do is look at the polling in the individual battleground states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and that's going to tell you who's going to be the next president. The razor thin margins right now for Donald Trump.
So you mentioned there some of the states will be quite tight. Do you think we could be into hanging Chad territory from the 2000 election?
It's very possible. I think so. And the states that you need to look at are Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in particular. And last election, we had the same kinds of issues post the victory of Joe Biden where things were challenged in the courts. And it's very, very likely that we could be looking at a scenario like that again in 2024.
And do you think it will be Biden versus Trump, despite the age of both the candidates?
Chris, I was in the UK about 6 months ago, and I did an interview where I said it would be highly unlikely to see both Joe Biden and Donald Trump as the candidates again for the 2024 election. But this is what we got. It is probably going to happen that these two are going to be our candidates with only a little bit of time left. Now, American history, this has only happened once before, and that was in 1892, where we've had two candidates run for an office for a job that they both have had before. So this is quite unique. And then you layer on top of that we have two candidates who are going to be in their 80s. Now, what's fascinating is, Chris, I don't know how old you are, but I'm a Generation X. We haven't had a Generation X president. We have skipped this generation. We went from Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, who were boomers, to President Trump, boomer, to Joe Biden, boomer, and we've skipped a generation, which I don't know what that says about American politics.
Well, what does it say? It's a slight mystery, I think, to people not paying full attention. to US politics that you can't find a candidate who's younger than his late 70s?
Well, it's because we have a bit of an established process here that in both party systems, people who have sort of played the game and who have been a part of the process and have done the work are the ones that end up being the candidates. And it's highly unlikely to see a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton at this particular point in American politics come out of nowhere. And it's a real shame. Plus, it's not a job that anybody really wants. I mean, I hate to say it, but we've gotten to the point where running for office, you have to put everything out there, your personal life, you're on social media, and it's an excruciating process to go through. And, the truth is we just haven't had very good candidates challenge either Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
Do you think lawsuits might be a factor? We're hearing in the UK this week that Donald Trump could be put on trial over one of the many lawsuits he's facing.
So by all accounts right now, we have 91 indictments against the former president, and he is like Teflon. And he also has an amazing legal team that has done a pretty good job of keeping these legal issues away from the politics right now. But here's the problem with all of this. Highly unlikely that there's any indictments that are going to happen prior to the election. But what it has done, and we've seen this, it's sucking the oxygen out of the room for Donald Trump. He's got to find himself in New York and Georgia, and he's doing those kinds of things instead of, frankly, being out on the campaign trail, which we know that's his best attribute. Big rallies, big campaigns, big events, that's what he does best. And as long as these court cases continue to drag him into the courtroom, it's going to be an ongoing problem for him.
So I guess his choice as vice president matters, because if he gets somebody who can stand in for him at those rallies and make a real impression, that will support Trump. But then Trump may not want a good VP.
That's a really good point. I mean, this VP choice, typically, it doesn't really make a difference. But again, we're in a unique situation where we've got two gentlemen who are in their 80s, and both, the picks that they've got, we've got Vice President Harris, she's on the ticket, but who former President Trump picks, I think is going to be an important decision for him.
Who's your top three for that job?
Listen, I would love to see him pick Sarah Huckabee, his former press secretary, who's now the governor of Arkansas. And I think that he needs that kind of person to be his vice president. And I mean, that's frankly my top choice. And my understanding is that he's got a short list of people. He's got guys like Ron DeSantis that are still sort of waiting in the wings. I don't think that's a real possibility, but I would say that those are some of the top candidates that I believe he's looking at.
Okay, so the VPs matter. I mean, you've met Trump a few times, that's right. And how have you found him?
Look, I find him also to be a very personable guy. I mean, he is enjoyable company to be around, and we've had several instances where we've been around him and his team. And, that the age thing is really fascinating to me because it seems to be a bigger issue for Joe Biden than it is for Donald Trump. And I don't know if it's a double standard, but Donald Trump has far more energy than 40 and 50-year-old candidates, which is something that when you meet him comes across pretty clear that the man has a lot of energy, has a lot of leadership. And, that's the view that a lot of people have about him, particularly, obviously, in the Republican Party.
And when you're with him privately, you see that, do you, for yourself?
Yes, you do. You see that privately. I mean, he's like the Energizer Bunny. I mean, he just goes and goes and goes. And it's pretty fascinating to see somebody at his age, particularly with the weight of the lawsuits that are coming down on him. I mean, when you're scrambling right now to find $350 million to post a bail in New York. Meanwhile, you're running for president, and every single day you have indictments that are coming across your desk. I mean, pretty amazing, and he's a pretty resilient person.
And do you think he can handle the biggest job in the world, of bring President of the United States on top of that workload of dealing with all the noises off, as we call them?
Well, he's done it his entire career. So, yes, I don't think there's any question about it that he's got the ability to do that.
And Biden, he does appear doddery on occasion, doesn't he?
Yeah, look, and I've met Joe Biden before in the past, too, President Biden, and I actually have a great deal of respect for him. I mean, he's had a really interesting and frankly difficult life.
Yeah.
He's lost a child. He's had all kinds of personal issues. He's got a son, Hunter, obviously, who's had some drug and alcohol issues. So, on a personal level, I have a lot of respect for Joe Biden. But I don't think you need to be a physician or a doctor to see what everybody else is seeing, which is he gets in front of the camera and he has a very difficult time. In most cases, he fumbles and bumbles around with leadership names of other presidents around the country or around the world. And I don't think, again, you need to be a physician to see what everybody else sees.
Why can't he see what everyone else sees? Why can't he do what Ravi Burns said, to see ourselves as others see us?
Because of the people that are behind him.
Yeah, that no one's saying to him, Joe, look in the mirror. It's not, you're getting on.
Yes, and also you have to think about the people that are working in and around him. I mean, this is a very powerful position. It's a powerful spot to be in the United States White House. It's a powerful position to be able to have the ear of the President of the United States. And these people are protecting their own jobs and their own positions of power as much as they are anything else.
And Gerry, what are the big issues you think might define the election campaign? Because some of them are ones of conscience, aren't they?
Look, we have inflation, we have immigration. Those are big issues right now. But there's something that is going to impact the battleground states in particular that not a lot of people are talking about. There are going to be 16 referendums on the issue of abortion in 16 different states. There is no question that that is going to drive out Democrat voters, and it could tip the scales in some places.
So those are on the same day as the election for the president, on the 5th of November.
Correct. And make no mistake about it, Chris, this is a coordinated strategy by the Democratic Party to put the question of abortion before voters because they know it's going to drive out Democratic voters, and it will. And you might see in some cases where people will come out and vote on that issue of abortion as big as what they will vote on for a president of the United States.
And just for a quick recap for our listeners in the UK, what does that mean? What is the question on abortion they'll be asking in those referendums?
The question will be whether or not the state itself will allow abortions to happen within the boundaries of their state. The abortion issue is, most people looked at it and said, oh my goodness, Roe v. Wade has been overturned, abortion is illegal. That's not exactly the case. It's a states' rights issue. That's all that it did. It said the states have the right to make that decision on their own. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to where we are, 2024. Well, you know what? Instead of having legislation, they're going to put it right to the people, and it's going to impact the turnout on that day.
And you think that will help the Democrats more than the Republicans?
No question about it. No question about it. It's coordinated to make sure that people aren't ambivalent when they wake up in the morning on November 5th. They're going to get out of bed and say, you know what? I may not like either one of these candidates, but that abortion issue, I'm coming to vote that day.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning there, Gerry, it'd be a tight election. We haven't mentioned the possibility of a third-party candidate.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility, and who will that hurt?
Well, this is just so interesting. You hear both campaigns saying that Robert F. Kennedy is going to hurt their party, the other party. I don't think that's true, and I think the Democrats are kidding themselves. Kennedy is a Democrat. He is a liberal Democrat. He has the Kennedy name, which is affiliated with the Democratic Party. And I don't think there's any question that this hurts Joe Biden more than it does anybody else.
Even though he's got these positions on vaccines.
He does. He does.
Controversial. Yeah.
He does. But it's still, again, the rest of his policies, if you look at him, he's clearly, on the left side of the Democratic Party. And the last time, again, looking at history here, this was Ross Perot.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting, Chris, is Ross Perot's party, by the way, was called the Reform Party.
Yeah. Well, that brings us neatly onto the UK. Of course, we will have a general election.
Yeah.
We know when yours is November 5th, 2024. Ours could be at any point between now and the third week of January 2025. Many people say on this podcast earlier, we had Joe Twyman from Delta Poll. He thinks November 21st, which will mean that if there's a Trump win, that could work against a Keir Starmer victory for some people, because Labour are seen to have issues with Trump that aren't there for the Tory party, maybe.
Well, I think 2016 was an interesting case study, because I believe for the first time, at least in modern politics, where something happened in the UK, Brexit, that had a big impact in the United States of America. I don't think there's any question about it. People woke up and said, oh my goodness, like serious change could happen. So if you look at that scenario, I'm obviously not embedded in UK politics, but if there's any kind of momentum, you would see it coming from the other direction than across the pond from here. And maybe a Trump victory, maybe a resounding victory by Trump, may open up some eyes in the UK and the rest of the world to say, okay, well, if the Americans can do it, maybe we ought to be thinking the same way.
And it may well help a certain Nigel Farage if he does come back to lead or a role within Reform UK. And if you reverse that, a Biden win, Biden, the White House, from our standpoint, has been rather ambivalent towards the UK in some parts.
Yes, it has.
Yeah,
you're not alone, Chris.
To put it politely, in some quarters. I guess you might expect Starmer to be boosted by a Biden win because of the historical links with the Democratic Party.
I suppose, again, it's possible that kind of momentum can go from, our shores across the Atlantic to you and have some kind of impact in the election. It's very possible.
Yeah. Do you ever talk much about the special relationship? We tend to obsess about it over here.
Look, me personally, I consider myself half a Brit. I understand the personal relationship quite well. You look at the Biden administration just in general and their policy towards the international community. It's been suspect. I don't think there's any question about it.
Yeah. Listen, it's been great to talk to you, Gerry Gunster from Gunster Worldwide Strategies. Have a great day. And enjoy the weather as spring comes towards us in the States.
Well, Chris, it's always a pleasure.
And I'll see you for that pint when you're
next back
in the UK. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Cheers, Gerry.
Cheers.
Gerry Gunster, thank you. And thank you to my guests today, Joe Twyman and Gerry Gunster. I'd love to know your thoughts on what you've heard from Gerry and Joe. Send me a tweet, Christopher Hope, on X, or email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends. And if you really enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to help other people find it. Thank the brilliant team of GB News colleagues behind this podcast, Mick Booker, Jeff Marsh, Rebecca Nunes, George McMillan, and Alistair Tallanter, and many other camera colleagues. Most of all, thank you for listening. For what more Chopper in your life, and who doesn't, frankly, catch me weekly when Parliament sits at midday on Wednesdays for PMQs Live, and keep up to our best political reporting on our website, gbnews.com. Until next time, though, cheerio!